Nellie Bly by Elizabeth Kula and Kristen Bobick. Nellie Bly was a stunt journalist in the late 1800s in New York and Pittsburgh. Stunt journalism was early investigative reporting, where the reporter was more interested in their cause than their writing. Since the start of her journalism career, Bly wrote to support causes she was passionate about. Some of these include feminism, oppression, and poverty. In 1887, Bly pretended to be mentally disabled to get into a New York insane asylum. She had to go through many obstacles to be enrolled in the asylum, including being diagnosed by many doctors. Inside the madhouse was horrifying. The nurses physically and mentally abused the patients, and the patients weren't given enough food. After 10 days, she was released from the asylum, and she wrote a book about all the terrible things she experienced there. There was a huge reform in the care of the people in the asylum because of her actions. Nurses treated the patients better, they were given better food, and the New York government spent more money than it ever had to improve insane asylums.
Elizabeth Cochran's journalism career started when she was 16 and moved to Pittsburgh to find a job. She noticed that only a few jobs were available to women, and even those were low-paying. While she was there, she read an article in Pittsburgh Dispatch called "What Girls Are Good For" by Erasmus Wilson or The Quiet Observer. The article said that women should only cook and clean, and if they wanted jobs, they should be nurses or teachers. Bly wrote a response to the Dispatch saying that women should be allowed to have whatever jobs they want and get the same pay that men would. The Dispatch's managing editor, George Madden, responded asking her what she would write about if she were a journalist. Cochran answered that she would write about things that ordinary people cared about. Madden was impressed and offered a job to Cochran writing articles about women's lives. Since it was unseemly for women to use their real names when writing, she used the name Nellie Bly after a famous song by Stephen Foster.
Nellie Bly, bring the room along. We'll sweep the kitchen clean, my dear, and have a little song. Oh, the wood-blind lady, love and make the fire burn, and I lay your and your love. Just give the rose a turn.
She often went undercover to get the full stories of what she was writing about.
Once Bly went undercover as a poor working woman looking for a job in a Pittsburgh nuts and bolts factory. At the factory, Oliver Brothers in Phillips, she met a little girl who worked there whose family can afford to send her to school. She was no older than 10 years old. Bly and the other workers at the factory got injured and exhausted from long hours of work. When Bly left the factory, she wrote an article exposing the child labor she had seen there. Joseph Pulitzer, the inventor of the Pulitzer Prize for reporters and comic strip authors, hired Bly to write for his newspaper, New York World, in 1887. On September 22nd, New York World asked Nellie Bly if she could go undercover inside an insane asylum on Blackwell Island in New York. World wanted Bly to write about the treatment of the patients and the methods of management there. I was intrigued by the idea. She had always wondered how the most helpless and delicate of people were treated. It was not easy to get into the asylum. She could either act insane in front of her friends, get two responsible physicians to commit her, or get sentenced there by a court ruling. She decided to first enlist in a woman's home by feigning poverty under the name Nellie Brown, so it would have the same initials as her name. She stayed there until the assistant matron at the home, Mrs. Stannard, began trying to have policemen remove her calmly from the house to avoid outbursts.
One of the policemen responded that if necessary, he would gladly drag her through the street. They took Bly to the police station and afterwards to court. The judge ruled that she was insane and had her checked by doctors who agreed. Bly was then sent to the Blackwell Island Asylum. When Bly wrote about the asylum, she said, "From the moment I entered the insane ward on the island, I made no attempt to keep up the assumed role of insanity.
This means that the asylum was frightening enough that even a normal person would act insane.
The conditions inside the asylum were terrible. The patients there were treated like the nurses' prisoners. The food was repulsive, but if the patients refused to eat it, they were threatened with harsh punishments." Bly wrote in her book that if the patients ever protested, the nurses would beat them. The patients sold all the clothing in the asylum, and they did all the cleaning too. When Bly met with her doctor, she urged them to release her and told them that she was just there to observe the patients and their treatment. Bly noticed that many of the other women there were sane too.
They were only there because someone had cruelly had them committed there. She was rescued after 10 days of living inside the asylum. After Bly was rescued from Blackwell Island's insane asylum, she appeared before the grand jury to be investigated on why she went there. She explained how the New York World newspaper only sent her there to investigate the conditions the insane were living in. She told them everything that happened in the asylum, how mean the nurses were, how bad the food was, and how the doctors never checked on them. I recommended that all of these things be changed as soon as possible. The court approved of the changes she recommended and provided to the insane $2,340,000, $1 million more than was ever given for the good of the insane. Of that amount, $50,000 to $60,000 was given to Blackwell Island. Bly wrote a book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, about how she and the other patients were treated at Blackwell and at the woman's home. The stunt journalism Bly did evolved into today's investigative reporting. While now we know that people go undercover in journalism, back then it was unheard of. Bly started a line of reporters who not only reported the news, but made the news.
Nellie Bly was known for her extravagant stunts, from first-hand experiencing oppression in factories to insane asylums. She was always looking for opportunities to help others despite the risks. Once she got into the asylum, there were no promises of when she would get out, if ever. Because of her courage in entering the asylum, there was an important reform in the way the insane there were treated. She wrote to help people. She didn't write only for her readers.
On the 27th of January, 1922, Nellie Bly died of pneumonia in New York. Though she lived almost a century ago, Bly's journalism legacy lives on today. Nellie Bly is remembered in part on who she was, but mostly on all the things that she achieved.